Good morning, everyone. So I'm Leon, and I'm the CEO of the Norfolk and Norwich Send Association, or Nansa, and co-creator of this Visible Festival. So one of my personal ambitions for the festival has been to see Obsessive Compulsive Disorder given a dedicated platform for discussion and understanding. It's a widely misunderstood disorder, and it can manifest in many different ways. My experience of OCD, like everyone's, is unique. And for some, including myself at points in my life, it has been incredibly debilitating. But by sharing my lived experience of OCD, I hope to contribute to a greater understanding and help to break down the stigma and the shame associated with it. So why it matters. The prevalence of OCD in the general population is around 2%. So 2% of people within the general population experience OCD. However, for those with ADHD, this increases to 11 to 23%. And for those who are autistic, it's greater still at 17 to 37%. So although OCD is often considered a standalone neurodivergent diagnosis, it is important to recognise its significant prevalence within the wider neurodivergent community. For example, individuals with ADHD and OCD may experience conflicting behavioural drivers in that ADHD can be driven by impulsivity, whereas OCD can be driven by compulsivity. So what we mean by that is that the impulsivity that many ADHDers experience can lead to risk-taking behaviours, which in turn can then lead to feelings of shame. And for those who have OCD, this shame can drive debilitating cycles of obsessive and compulsive behaviours. So these competing drivers can make self-regulation particularly complex and challenging, and it's something we will explore further in this session. So some of you might be surprised to learn that there are many types of OCD, and in a moment we'll explore each of these in greater detail. The 8 types of OCD are contamination and cleaning OCD, checking OCD, symmetry, order and just right OCD, intrusive thoughts, purely obsessional, or what's known as pure O OCD, hoarding OCD, which is different from hoarding disorder, but there can be an overlap, harm OCD, relationship OCD or ROCD, and existential philosophical OCD. So many people have mixed presentations, not usually a single type, and I myself have dealt with multiple types of OCD. I was diagnosed at the age of 12, along with PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, and suspected ADHD, although anyone that knows me well knows you don't need to suspect that I have ADHD. I lost my mother to breast cancer when I was just shy of 5 years old, so as a child, a fear of losing someone close to me seemed to drive much of my OCD behaviour. Now, I could give so many examples of how I have experienced OCD over the years. It's not something that I currently struggle with, and at this moment in time, I find it manageable, and it doesn't negatively impact me as to the extent it once did, or may do again in the future. But it's important to note that for myself at least, there has been difficult times where OCD has caused me significant distress. But there are good times too, when it has arguably had a positive impact on my life. And that could be surprising to some people, even those who do experience OCD, and it is something we're going to explore later. But going back to my earlier point that those with OCD can experience multiple types, this is well evidenced by my own experience in that I have experienced 7 of the 8 types listed on the screen. The only type I haven't experienced actually is hoarding OCD. So describing personal experiences of OCD is challenging, and those of us that experience it recognise that our fears and compulsions are irrational, and that's something I'm going to repeat a lot through the session. We know it's irrational. We don't need someone else to tell us it's not real. We know it's not real. And for me, at least, there's always been this voice of logic in the back of my head telling me to get a grip, you know, this isn't real. But so often the compulsion just reinforces the fear and you just feel powerless to fight it. So I think I speak on behalf of most people who experience OCD when I say we know our fears are irrational. That's why it's so exhausting. And our fears and compulsions are so challenging to explain, either through an inability to articulate the fear or to the added fear or shame of others thinking that we're mad or crazy. Earlier we discussed how prevalent OCD is in the autistic population. Having worked with many autistic people throughout my own career in health and social care, I frequently recognise the rituals and compulsive behaviours that might be, but not necessarily always, as a result of OCD. And for a non-verbal autistic person, can you imagine how much more challenging it must be to try and share how you're feeling and what's driving those behaviours? I articulate fairly well, I believe, and it's a struggle that I have myself. And apologies, this session is very scripted. I normally like to speak more freely, but I wanted to get this right and do it in the right way. So let's explore the 8 types of OCD, and where applicable, I'll share some of my own experiences. So first up, contamination and cleaning OCD. So the core fear here is germs, illness, dirt, chemicals, or something feeling contaminated. But that fear of contamination could also be something moral or non-literal. It could be, for example, a behaviour and you feel contaminated because of a certain experience. So it could be emotional contamination too. The common compulsions, perhaps what we typically, those who haven't experienced OCD, perhaps typically perceive this as OCD. So excessive hand washing, showering, doing the laundry, avoiding public places or touching objects or contact with people, and cleaning items repeatedly or in specific sequences. So the obvious impact, it can cause severe avoidance behaviours and even health issues such as skin irritation if you're constantly cleaning, for example. So for me, an example of how hold on a minute. So yes, I've experienced this in many different ways, but to give you just one simple example. So at quite a young age, I developed a fear of leaving unattended drinks. So if you're in a nightclub, that would seem quite sensible. But this is so extreme that I could, for example, at my worst, I could have a cup of tea, I could put it down, I could leave the room in my own home, and then when I come back to that cup of tea, I wouldn't be able to drink it because I've left it unattended. So therefore I tip it out, I make another one. And as I say, the whole time I know this isn't rational. I know there's nothing wrong with the cup of tea, but it doesn't change the fact that I feel I have to do the compulsion to eradicate the fear. Once I've done that and I'm sat with my cup of tea, I'm fine again. So to be clear, the fear and obsession here is the contamination, and the compulsion is the fact I've discarded the tea and I've made a new one. I've experienced this in many other different ways, but that's just to give, I feel, quite a simple, easy to understand example. So checking OCD. So here, the fear is that harm will occur because of negligence, mistakes, or incomplete actions. So common compulsions could be repeatedly checking locks, or stoves, or appliances, or even documents, and seeking reassurance for others. So you might, you leave the home with your family and you're constantly asking your family, did you turn the oven off? Was this switch off? And reviewing your own memories to confirm that actions were done correctly. So the impact, it can delay leaving home, completing tasks, or making decisions. So here I would strongly recommend a recent BBC drama. It's still available on iPlayer and it's called Waiting for the Out. I don't know if anyone's watched that. It's not a feel-good show, but it does illustrate how debilitating this type of OCD can be. So the drama centres around Dan, who struggles to leave his flat through a fear of the stove being left on. So his compulsions begin, he's just checking and then he leaves. Then it moves on to him taking photographs, which he can look at during the day. And eventually he ends up with a live feed camera that he can just look at throughout his whole day at work to reaffirm to himself that the oven is off. So like Dan, I too have experienced this, and in order to leave the house, I too have had to take photographs of taps, switches, the oven. And at first this seems like a really great solution because you feel like, oh, you know, now I haven't got to check, I've got these photos. It becomes a sort of safety blanket. But the problem is, by taking the photos, I may have eliminated the need to check, but then the very act of taking the photos becomes the compulsion itself, and it only just reinforces the fear further. So you just end up in this kind of cycle. So next up, symmetry, order, and just right OCD. So the core fear here is that things will feel wrong or incomplete, or that harm will be caused unless things are arranged correctly. So common compulsions: aligning or arranging objects until they feel right, counting or repeating actions until things feel balanced, or rewriting or retyping text until spacing or letters are perfect. The impact: it can cause hours lost to arranging or repeating behaviours. And here, this isn't you look up at the wall and you realise a picture isn't straight. This is like it's a real deep need for things to just feel right. For me, this is probably one of the earliest experiences of OCD. I'd say all my early OCD was pretty much of this type. So as a child, for example, if I walked through a door and I accidentally banged my elbow, I'd have to bang the other one to even it out. And then if I felt I'd banged that one too hard, I'd have to bang the other one again. And I just ended up in this situation where I was banging my elbows and banging my knees again and again and again. So exhausting, again, even at that age, I knew, irrational, but obviously quite painful as well. Intrusive thoughts and purely obsessional, so pure O. So the fear here is having unwanted thoughts about harm, sex, morality, or taboo subjects, and believing these thoughts mean something more than they do, or that they're dangerous or shameful. So sometimes it can be the fact that you think of these things that you absolutely don't want to think about, like you would feel like it's abnormal for you to think that way, and that's really where the shame comes from, whether that's about harm to yourself or harm to others. It doesn't mean, again, that you feel you want to self-harm or anything like that. It hasn't got that, it's not that tangible. It is just purely intrusive thoughts that slip in and they kind of preoccupy your mind. So the common compulsions here are mental rituals like trying to neutralize thoughts by thinking of other things, or counting, or praying, and avoiding certain triggers. So you might want to avoid certain people, places, media, and just constantly seeking reassurance. For example, you'd never do that, or this would never happen. So the impact is that obviously it causes quite severe emotional distress, guilt, shame, and it often has no visible compulsions. So for me, and I think probably for a lot of people who have experienced this has been the most challenging aspect of OCD, and somewhat of a constant throughout my life. So I have found pure O to be so debilitating, experiencing such powerful feelings of dread and feeling unable to devise any effective compulsions in order to counteract it. So this is why it can be referred to as pure O, because here the OCD can be purely obsessional. There won't necessarily be the compulsions. For me, the intrusive thoughts tend to focus on something bad happening to me or my family, and I'll play scenarios over and over in my head night and day, and that anxiety then just builds up, and it normally leads to quite extreme panic attacks. As I say, at difficult points in my life. I don't want to claim that this is a constant. It's not something I'm experiencing to a particularly negative, it's not negatively impacting my life all that much at this moment in time, but it absolutely has in the past. Hoarding OCD. So here the fear is that you may discard something that's important or cause harm by throwing it away. There's a real overlap here, you might notice. A lot of OCD, although we have the specific harm OCD, much of OCD is built around this fear of harm. So common compulsions could be just keeping items just in case, difficulty discarding even low value items, organising and reorganising possessions instead of parting with them. And the impact: clutter, functional impairment, conflict with others. As I said, I've not experienced hoarding OCD myself, so I can't give an example from my point of view. So harm OCD. So core fear, causing harm to oneself or others, either intentionally or accidentally. Common compulsions, avoiding sharp objects, avoiding driving, cooking or being alone with others, repeatedly checking your own actions or memories, and constantly reassurance seeking, so I wouldn't hurt someone or this isn't going to happen. Impact, avoidance of normal daily activities and very high anxiety. So for me, this type somewhat overlaps with intrusive thoughts or pure O. So during periods of mental ill health, mainly in my teens, many of my compulsions related to an irrational fear that if I didn't do certain things, something bad would happen. So I felt these rituals were necessary to safeguard myself and others from harm. Again, I want to repeat, I knew it was irrational and I knew that that didn't make sense, but the compulsions continued regardless. So the severity of those compulsions ranged from I used to have to run from the park to my home, and I would give myself a time to do that in my head. And if I didn't make it home by the count in my head, I felt something bad would happen. And the most ridiculous thing about this is you'd think I would have just given myself a time that I could easily achieve, but I wouldn't. It would be like I would give myself within a second to be able to get there. And of course, if I got there in that amount of time, I'd shorten it the next time. It was like this constant battle. So that's, again, that's probably one of a more simplistic examples of one of the compulsions I devised. But one of the more debilitating compulsions I experienced required me to stay awake. So a lot of people with OCD also experience night terrors. I had quite severe night terrors as a child, and I was convinced, again, convinced probably isn't the right word because I knew it wasn't real, but I would convince myself that if I was to have these bad dreams about losing people in my family, that they would come true. So the obvious approach for me was if I didn't go to sleep, then I wouldn't have the dream and therefore nothing bad would happen. I've had many other compulsions, and some of which to be honest, I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing in this forum, but I have swapped notes, if you like, with other people who have experienced OCDs. And what always really fascinates me is how many shared obsessions and compulsions people with OCD share. Like, it's it's very odd sometimes that you can have what you feel is a very unique compulsion, you think is very unique to you, and you'll speak to someone else who experiences OCD and you'll find that they've been doing the exact same thing. Relationship OCD, ROCD. So the core fear here is doubts about one's feelings or their partner's feelings or the rightness of a relationship. Does the relationship feel right? Common compulsions, mentally reviewing the relationship, comparing partner to others, and seeking reassurance constantly about love or compatibility. And that obviously causes a real strain on relationships and chronic doubt. So relationships are very important to me, but at times in my life, my insecurities and fears have meant that I would need to seek constant reassurance. This can be incredibly full on. As an ADHDer, makes it perhaps a little extra full on and overwhelming for the other person or persons. So of course, my logical brain knows this, but again, knowing that I then might be too full on and pushing the other person away only reinforces that insecurity, and I end up again in this cycle where I seek more and more reassurance, and in doing so feel like I'm pushing people further and further away. Existential philosophical OCD. So the core fear here is becoming stuck in big unanswerable questions. So big questions about life, reality, or existence. Common compulsions, repeatedly analysing or researching or even avoiding existential topics, mentally reviewing and debating, and avoidance of triggers. So example, avoiding books, films, and even conversations, just so as not to be triggered. Impact, detachment from daily life due to overthinking. I've got a long example here, so I'm just going to have a sip of water. So these are the big questions in life, or the things we have no real control over. So space, the universe, asteroids, wars, pandemic, afterlife, religion, etc. This has been another very impactful manifestation of OCD in my life. So after the attacks on the World Trade Center in September the 11th, 2001, I became so fearful of war that I could barely watch TV through fear of someone even mentioning it. I could avoid the news. At that time, we didn't have like loads of 24-hour rolling news like we do now. It was quite easy to avoid the news. But I would be continuously anxious watching the telly that we would get one of those breaking news bulletins like we used to, where the show would be interrupted and it would tell me something I absolutely didn't want to hear. For a time, I wouldn't even walk in a shop that sold newspapers because I would be terrified that I may accidentally see a headline on the newspaper that would trigger me. And if I heard anyone at the bus stop even discussing it, I would have to take myself away from the situation. So like the slide shows, my compulsion was a conscious and exhausting avoidance. It was a real commitment to avoidance, which did create a real detachment from a healthy life. However, I added these notes in this morning when I gave this a read through, because I guess with everything that's going on in the world right now, you may assume that I would be really struggling right now. But I don't know if this is something that others with OCD have experienced, but I think I obsessed over those topics for such a long time, I almost desensitized myself to it. So I can honestly say now, I can get home, I can put the news on with everything that's going on in the world, I can actually get quite drawn into it, and I have no, if anything, maybe I'm a little bit too numb to it. And I think that I've probably desensitized myself with that particular issue over a number of years, because as a child, it was absolutely, and leading up to, before September the 11th, it was also the first Iraq war, the Gulf War. I was a bit obsessed with that as a child. So I've spent decades perhaps over analysing this, and I do feel to a degree I have sort of desensitized myself to that a bit. So, after exploring each type of OCD and how it manifests, I hope you can appreciate how challenging it can be. I also want people to understand that I don't stand up here free of shame and embarrassment. And like most people who have OCD, the idea of sharing my experiences, particularly in relation to compulsions, makes me feel as if I have to then constantly justify that I'm not crazy or unstable. Hence, there's only a limit to how much I'm willing to share today. But in truth, right now, I do consider myself, in the here and now at least, to be fairly level-headed, fairly headstrong, and quite resilient. I think it has given me a resilience over the years. I know my compulsions were irrational, as I've said, and I've always known that. But a greater respect and understanding for the human brain and how stress, trauma, and neurological differences can have such a profound impact on us and our behaviour has helped me manage, even embrace my OCD. So before we move on, I would also like to mention that my diagnosis came from my GP in 1996. So I have always felt there is a lack of support, and I've always found there to be a lack of support and advice around OCD. And for anyone who is concerned they may have OCD and would like to explore this, my advice would be, in the first instance, even 30 years on from my diagnosis, probably start with a conversation with your GP. So, now I want to shift the discussion a bit, and I want to talk about the positives. So I know that for many people, including those who experience OCD themselves, the idea that there could be a positive impact could seem ridiculous. And this is one of the many reasons why I feel strongly that the Visible Festival features this topic. So neurodiversity is somewhat of a hot topic at the moment, and schools, employers, and society as a whole has begun to recognise more and more so these potential positives, or let's say, for example, ADHD and autism, hyperfocus, attention to detail. We hear this stuff a lot, but we don't necessarily hear that about OCD. So I've already explored why sharing experiences of OCD can be so difficult. And after everything I've shared about myself, I could be fearful that I now sound unemployable. So why should you employ me? But small caveat, this is a hypothetical question and I'm not actually actively seeking work at this time. I first joined Nansa 10 years ago, having previously worked in both the charity and private sector in various health and social care leadership roles. And in January 2020, I was honoured to be appointed as Nansa's CEO. The idea that I would be a custodian of a charity that had existed since the 1950s was very special to me. And I asked myself, what kind of custodian and what kind of leader would I be? And then it happened. Less than 3 months into my time as CEO at Nansa, the world changed and along came a global pandemic. So earlier on I explained that the most exhausting feature of OCD, for me at least, is that I know my fears are irrational, and that the compulsions and rituals in response to those fears, they're pointless. But now those fears were tangible, So they were real, and all of a sudden, while so many people around me were terrified of this new plague, I felt like I'd been in training my whole life for this. The pandemic brought out the very best in me. Having spent most of my life alleviating my own fears, suddenly I realised how good I could be at alleviating the fears of others. Throughout the pandemic, I felt able to digest what was happening, anticipate threats and risks, and devise appropriate responses, navigating our charity through the various challenges while providing continuity, normality, and reassurance to those we support. So now I want to get a little bit sciencey and look at how OCD as a specific neurotype might have supported my navigation as a charity leader during the pandemic. So here is the brain, and I want to introduce you to 3 specific areas of the brain that play a key role in how OCD functions. So the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, is responsible for monitoring errors, detecting conflicts, and signalling when something doesn't feel right. It's essentially the brain's internal alarm system. The orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC, is responsible for evaluating consequences, assigning value to decisions, and predicting potential outcomes, especially related to risk or reward. And the amygdala is responsible for processing emotions, especially fear, and helping us anticipate and respond to threats. These 3 areas are more active in individuals with OCD, which helps explain some of the core experiences we'll be discussing. Before we look at what some of the advantages might look like, just briefly, this is how the OCD brain works differently. So, heightened error monitoring and hyper-awareness. So individuals with OCD often show excessive activation in the ACC, the brain region responsible for detecting errors and conflict. Now, this hyperactivity is linked to increased sensitivity to mistakes or things feeling off. So this heightened vigilance can give the subjective impression of sensing problems before they're obvious. Many people with OCD will feel that they have perhaps the easiest way to put it, I think, quite a high emotional intelligence. They feel very attuned to what's going on around them, and this would kind of make sense based on that. Threat detection and anticipation. So OCD is also associated with heightened activity in the OFC and the amygdala during the anticipation of uncertain or aversive threats. Now, some theories here suggest that while this safety system within the brain is meant to predict and avoid threats, in OCD it can overestimate the threat, or it can fail to signal that the danger has passed. So that's what potentially leads to the repetitive checking or compulsions. And 3, attention bias. So eye tracking studies indicate that people with OCD spend more time fixating on stimuli related to their obsessions and or compulsive behaviours. So they have quite a narrowed vigilance that can make certain triggers or patterns stand out more. Again, so it makes you feel a little bit more aware of something, but actually it's probably more because you're more narrowly focused on that particular thing. For people with OCD, this can sometimes be interpreted as a sharper instinct. It could be argued that someone with OCD can bring a surprising number of strengths to the workplace, especially if their environment and role are a good fit for their working style. So we will move on to that now. So, while OCD can create challenges, many traits that come with it can also be assets when supported and channeled well. So, exceptional attention to detail. So, as discussed previously, OCD is associated with heightened activity in brain regions involved in error detection and threat monitoring. So, this heightened activation can translate into increased sensitivity to discrepancies, inconsistencies, or potential risks. Individuals with OCD may experience a stronger internal signal when something feels off or driven by the ACC's amplified error monitoring function. Additionally, the attention bias towards OCD relevant cues can mean that details, patterns, or irregularities can stand out more, and we can hold our attention for longer potentially on those things. So while the vigilance can sometimes feel quite intrusive or exhausting in typical OCD, like we discussed at the beginning of the session, in the right context, it can also support precision and accuracy. When well supported and appropriately channeled, this heightened detail attention can be a valuable asset in roles requiring meticulous review and risk awareness, such as quality assurance, compliance, editing, auditing, research, and data analysis. In environments that value thoroughness and structured processes, this neurological sensitivity to errors can contribute to high standards and reduced oversight and mistakes. Next up, a strong sense of responsibility. So those with OCD can experience quite an amplified sense of responsibility and what's right, especially around preventing harm, avoiding mistakes, or ensuring that actions align with personal and professional standards. So for those who experience primarily obsessional forms of OCD, so pure O, this can present as a strong internal drive to act ethically, follow procedures carefully, and ensure that decisions are fair and morally sound. While this heightened responsibility can at times feel burdensome, in supported environments it can also foster conscientiousness and integrity. And in the workplace, this can show up as a deep commitment to doing things properly, meeting deadlines, adhering to regulations, double-checking work, and maintaining high ethical standards. When well supported and balanced, this strong internal accountability can make individuals with OCD highly reliable in roles that require consistency, compliance, procedural accuracy, and trust. High standards and work ethic. So for many people with OCD, there is a deep internal discomfort when something feels incomplete, inconsistent, or not quite right. As we explored earlier, that not right signal can be persistent and very difficult for us to ignore. While this is exhausting in our personal lives, in the right professional context, it can translate into a strong drive towards excellence. Tasks are not simply completed, they are refined, reviewed, and revisited until they meet a high internal standard. This isn't just about perfectionism in a superficial sense. It is often rooted in a profound sense of responsibility, risk awareness, and a desire to prevent negative outcomes or harm. When driven by fear of error, fear of harm, or a commitment to doing things properly, many individuals with OCD develop exceptional persistence in problem solving. As I shared in my own experience during the pandemic, when threats became tangible rather than irrational, When threats became tangible rather than irrational, the very systems that once fueled my anxiety became assets. The ability to anticipate risk, think through worst case scenarios, and stay with a problem until a workable solution emerged proved invaluable. So when balanced and supported, this drive can result in relentless follow-through, thorough planning, high quality output, and a refusal to cut corners. Of course, unchecked perfectionism can become counterproductive, but in a structured environment that values precision, preparation, and accountability, this tendency towards high standards can contribute to outstanding professional performance. I'm talking generally here, not about myself. I'm sometimes outstanding, but not all the time. Thoroughness and organisation. As we've explored, the OCD brain is highly attuned to errors, uncertainty, and potential risk. When the ACC signals that something is off, or the OFC anticipates possible consequences, it can be difficult to move forward or past that without creating clarity and control. So one way this often manifests in the workplace is through structure, clear systems, documented processes, contingency plans, and organised workflows that reduce ambiguity. And ambiguity, as well as being difficult to say, is often what drives anxiety. For many individuals with OCD, organisation is not just a preference, it's a strategy, and it's a necessity. A well-structured system provides reassurance that risks have been considered, steps haven't been missed, and responsibilities are clearly defined. So in leadership or team settings, this can translate into careful documentation of procedures, transparent communication or expectations, detailed planning and risk assessments, and orderly systems that reduce confusion for others. As I experienced during the pandemic, creating structure in uncertain times was not just helpful, it was stabilising. The same instincts that once fueled internal anxiety became a framework for external reassurance. And by anticipating challenges and putting systems in place early, it was possible to provide continuity and confidence for others. When balanced, this thoroughness doesn't just benefit the individual, it can enhance efficiency, clarity, and accountability across the whole team. Strong memory for details. So one of the most exhausting aspects of OCD can be the repetitive nature of intrusive thoughts. Scenarios are replayed, analysed, and mentally revisited over and over and over again. Now, while this can be distressing when focused on fears, it also reflects a brain that encodes and revisits information deeply. So the heightened activity in those brain regions that we've discussed, combined with an attention bias toward personally relevant stimuli, can mean that details are not easily dismissed. Information linked to perceived importance, risk, or responsibility tends to be retained with precision. In a workplace context, this can translate into a strong recall of conversations, decisions, and commitments. One of my own personal frustrations is that I can always remember in-depth conversations that happen between multiple people. And then months later, we can bring this up and I can say that this was said. And I find it infuriating that other people can't remember the conversation. And people who work with me know this about me. So remembering procedural steps or regulatory requirements accurately, retaining historical knowledge that informs present decision making, and noticing when something deviates from a previous pattern. So when channeled constructively, this capacity for detailed recall can be particularly valuable in technical, compliance-based, investigative, legal, financial, or historically informed roles where accuracy and continuity matter. As with many OCD-related traits, the key difference lies in where the focus is directed. So when attention is anchored into meaningful professional tasks rather than intrusive fears, this depth of processing can become a strength rather than a burden. Risk awareness and preventative thinking. So many people with OCD spend considerable time thinking about what if scenarios. So while this can be distressing when the threat is irrational or disproportionate, it also reflects a nervous system that is highly attuned to potential risk. So when grounded in real-world decision-making, this anticipatory thinking can become an asset. Rather than reacting to problems after they occur, individuals with OCD may instinctively scan for vulnerabilities, consider worst-case outcomes, and put preventative measures in place early. As I experienced during the pandemic, when uncertainty was no longer hypothetical, but real, this way of thinking became stabilising rather than debilitating to me. The ability to digest evolving information, anticipate possible disruptions, and plan accordingly supported clear decision-making at a critical time. In professional environments, this can translate into proactive risk assessment, strong safeguarding instincts, detailed contingency planning, and careful compliance with regulation and safety protocols. In roles involving safety, governance, finance, security, health, or organisational leadership, this preventative mindset can help reduce exposure to avoidable risks. And as always, balance matters. But when supported and channeled appropriately, the same system that once overestimated danger can become a powerful tool for preparedness and resilience. And then finally, persistence and dedication. One of the defining features of OCD is the difficulty in disengaging from something that feels unresolved. So when the brain's error monitoring and threat detection systems remain active, it can be incredibly hard for us to just let go. So while this can be distressing when attached to intrusive fears, that same neurological persistence can, in the right context, become sustained focus and determination. Once committed to a goal, individuals with OCD may find it very difficult to abandon halfway. This can translate professionally into staying with complex or challenging projects over a long time, continuing to refine and improve work despite setbacks, demonstrating loyalty and commitment to organisational aims, and maintaining momentum when others lose focus. In my own experience, particularly during periods of crisis, this persistence became a source of stability. When circumstances were uncertain and constantly shifting, the ability to stay engaged, keep thinking ahead, and remain committed to safeguarding the organisation and the people we support was invaluable. Persistence in OCD is not casual, it's often very intense, and when that intensity is directed towards something constructive rather than fear-driven cycles, it can support resilience, endurance, and long-term achievement. As with all the strengths we've discussed, context and support are crucial, but when channeled well, this dedication can be one of the most powerful professional assets of all. So of course everyone's experience of OCD is different, and for some it can be profoundly debilitating. And I have certainly experienced periods of that in my life where it has been exactly that. OCD is not something that I romanticise. It has brought challenge, exhaustion, and moments of deep distress. But it is also part of who I am, the good, the bad, and the difficult. There was a time when I never would have imagined speaking about my experiences this openly, and particularly in a professional setting. The shame felt too heavy, the fear of being misunderstood or perceived as unstable or unemployable was too great. Yet so much of OCD's power lies in silence. It thrives in secrecy, in embarrassment, in the quiet belief that we must hide parts of ourselves. The more we talk about it honestly, responsibly, and without sensationalism, the less power it has. Understanding replaces stigma, compassion replaces judgment. And perhaps most importantly, conversation creates space, space for support, for strength, and for recognising that neurodivergence in all its forms carries both challenge and capability. Thank you. Before we move on to questions where they're going to cut the camera, there's one question I already want to answer on camera because it's a question that constantly comes up. And this is where I don't want to presume or assume anyone does or doesn't have OCD. But one thing someone will always say to me is, oh, you know, when I leave the house, I really struggle. I worry about turning the oven off, or I worry about the taps. And then I say, do you do it all the time? And that's the thing. It's like at times of stress, I think everyone can relate to what people with OCD experience, because at times of stress, we naturally do those things. We doubt ourselves, we check things, we maybe want the room tidier. But with OCD, this is minute after minute, day after day, night after night. You cannot think about anything else. So it's absolutely not for me to say whether someone does or doesn't have OCD, but I just wanted to make that distinction before we turn the camera off, that I think it's important for people to take away. It's great that someone can relate to what someone with OCD experiences, but it's very much, it's complete, you are immersed in it. This isn't something that you just feel on a down day.